Imagine a world where beauty was a kind of truth, where every gesture, every word, and every stone was meant to honor the gods. A place where freedom meant duty, and the pursuit of wisdom was life's highest art. In ancient Greece, men debated the nature of justice beneath marble columns, while women wove the fabric of the home, unseen but essential. Philosophers sought immortality through reason, sculptors through form, and athletes through the perfect symmetry of the body. But beneath the glory of temples and the poetry of democracy lay a world bound by hierarchy, devotion, and sacrifice, where greatness was measured not in gold, but in the harmony between body, mind, and soul. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these journeys into the past. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing history connect us across distance and time. Now dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum and let the echoes of the Aegean carry you back to a civilization that shaped everything we call beautiful and defined what it meant to be human. Let's set the scene. Daily life in ancient Greece was defined by the relationship between the polis, the city-state, and the oikos, the household. The polis represented the political, social, and religious structure of public life. The oikos embodied the domestic, private sphere that sustained it. Every activity from agriculture to worship reflected this dual structure. The well-being of the polis depended on the stability and productivity of its households, while the household's honor and prosperity relied upon its recognition within the civic community. Greek settlements developed along coastlines and mountain valleys where arable land was scarce. The geography of the Aegean basin, rugged terrain, poor soils, and short rivers limited large-scale farming and promoted small, independent communities. Most city-states were compact, often centered around an acropolis, a fortified hilltop, and surrounded by countryside, known as the chora, which provided food and raw materials. Athens, for example, occupied the fertile plain of Attica, but still relied heavily on imported grain, especially after the 5th century BCE. The climate of Greece encouraged an outdoor civic culture. Summers were hot and dry, while winters were mild and wet. This seasonal rhythm dictated both agriculture and civic activity. Planting took place in autumn, fieldwork intensified in spring, and the dry season of summer became a period for festivals, markets, and military campaigns. These environmental conditions shaped not only subsistence patterns, but also the social and religious calendar of every polis. The oikos was the fundamental unit of Greek society. It consisted of the nuclear family, enslaved laborers, and sometimes extended relatives. The head of the household, known as the kyrios, held legal and economic authority. Property, inheritance, and even marriage arrangements fell under his control. Women, children, and slaves were considered part of the household's property and legal responsibility, though each group played essential economic and social roles. Women in classical Greece, especially in Athens, were largely confined to domestic spaces. Their duties centered on weaving, spinning, managing household stores, and raising children. Wealthier women supervised enslaved workers who carried out much of this labor. In poorer families, women performed the work themselves. Greek literature and inscriptions reveal that respectability for women was associated with discretion and seclusion, while visibility in public was often linked to disrepute. However, this varied by region. Spartan women, for example, enjoyed greater physical freedom and property rights than their Athenian counterparts. Children were raised to reflect civic ideals. Boys were educated in reading, writing, music, and physical training, preparing them for citizenship and military service. Girls learned domestic skills and religious customs within the home. Education was primarily private. Wealthier families hired tutors, while poorer families relied on communal or limited instruction. Free citizens represented only a portion of the population. Beneath them were metics, resident foreigners who lived and worked within the polis but lacked political rights. They were essential to trade, craftsmanship and maritime commerce, paying taxes and often serving in the military. The lowest social class consisted of enslaved persons who could be captured in war, born into slavery, or purchased through trade. In Athens, during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, estimates suggest that enslaved people made up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total population. Slavery permeated nearly every sector of the economy. Enslaved men labored in mines, workshops, and agriculture. Women served as domestic workers, wet nurses, or textile laborers. Some skilled slaves, such as scribes or artisans, managed workshops on behalf of their masters. Although Greek philosophical thought occasionally questioned the morality of slavery, no city-state abolished it. The institution was seen as natural and necessary for maintaining the leisure required of citizens to participate in politics and intellectual life. Diet and material life in Greece reflected both environmental constraints and cultural preference. The Mediterranean triad, grain, olives and wine, formed the foundation of nutrition. Barley was the primary cereal because it tolerated poor soils better than wheat. Bread and porridge were staples, supplemented by olives, figs, cheese, legumes, and seasonal vegetables. Meat was rare in daily life and usually consumed during religious festivals after sacrifices. Fish, particularly in coastal cities, provided protein more regularly. Water was drawn from public fountains or wells, while olive oil served both culinary and practical uses. It was employed in cooking, lamp fuel, hygiene, and athletic anointing. Wine, typically mixed with water, was central to both social and religious life. The relative simplicity of diet concealed a complex economic network, imported wheat from Egypt and the Black Sea, traded oil and wine, and local craft production supported the interdependence of city and countryside. The polis functioned as a community of citizens rather than simply a geographic area. Political participation was limited to adult free males who had completed military training. Citizenship conferred the right to vote, hold office, and own land. It also imposed duties, military service, financial contributions to festivals, and participation in juries and assemblies. Athens developed the most sophisticated form of direct democracy in the ancient world. Decisions on war, foreign policy, and legislation were made in the ecclesia, assembly, where citizens voted by show of hands. Administrative and judicial matters were managed by the boule, council, and large juries selected by lot. Despite its democratic ideals, Athenian citizenship excluded women, foreigners, and enslaved people, making the system simultaneously inclusive and exclusionary. Other polis, such as Sparta or Corinth, adopted oligarchic or mixed constitutions, emphasizing military discipline or aristocratic rule rather than popular sovereignty. Public space reflected civic identity. The agora or marketplace served as the center of economic, political, and social exchange. Surrounded by stores, temples, and administrative buildings, it was both a marketplace and a meeting ground. Citizens debated, traded, and worshipped here, demonstrating the Greek belief that civic engagement was integral to moral virtue. Temples and sanctuaries dotted city and countryside alike, linking religious practice with the polis identity and continuity. Greek architecture and urban planning emphasized the distinction between public and private realms. Temples, theaters, and gymnasia expressed the collective values of the community, while domestic architecture was deliberately modest. Houses typically turned inward, organized around a courtyard that provided light, ventilation, and privacy. In Athens, wealth was shown through generosity to the city, financing public buildings or sponsoring dramatic performances, rather than through ostentatious private display. This division extended to gendered spaces. Men spent much of their time in public, at the agora, gymnasium, or assembly, while women's activities centered on the household. Yet in religion, women played indispensable roles. Female priesthoods, festivals such as the Thesmophoria, honoring Demeter, and domestic rites at household shrines offered women recognized forms of public participation. Life in ancient Greece was not uniform, but structured by shared assumptions about hierarchy, citizenship, and the relationship between private labor and public virtue. The polis depended on the oikos for economic and moral stability, while the oikos relied on the polis for protection and identity. Beneath the celebrated achievements of democracy, art, and philosophy lay a society maintained by strict gender roles, class distinctions, and widespread enslavement. Understanding this balance between freedom and dependence is essential to comprehending how the Greeks conceived of civilization itself. While the polis provided the framework of Greek political and cultural life, it was the countryside that sustained its population. The vast majority of Greeks in the archaic and classical periods lived not within city walls, but across rural districts, in small villages and farmsteads scattered along terraced hillsides and narrow plains. Agriculture was not merely an occupation, but the foundation of economic, religious, and moral order. The ideal citizen was, above all, a landholder who worked or oversaw his own plot. The geography of Greece imposed strict conditions on agricultural life. Mountainous terrain and thin, stony soils restricted cultivation to small valleys and coastal plains. Only about 1/5 of the land could be farmed effectively, and irrigation was minimal. Rainfall was concentrated in the winter months, making autumn sowing and spring harvests essential. Drought, erosion, and sudden storms were recurring threats. Archaeological and literary evidence alike emphasize the fragility of harvests. Hesiod, writing in the 7th century BCE, warned that one season's neglect could destroy a farmer's livelihood. In response to these environmental constraints, Greek agriculture developed as a system of mixed farming. Rather than large monocultures, smallholders combined grain cultivation with olive groves, vineyards, and pasture for goats and sheep. This diversification minimized risk and ensured some return even in poor years. Olive trees thrived on rocky slopes unsuitable for grain, while vines prospered in the same dry conditions. Sheep and goats, able to graze on scrub and mountain grass, provided milk, wool, and meat. The resulting pattern was one of modest self-sufficiency rather than surplus production. The triad of grain, olives, and wine defined Greek agriculture. Barley, Hordeum vulgar, was the principal cereal, favored over wheat for its resilience to poor soils and low rainfall. It was ground into flour for bread, or mixed with water to make maza, a staple porridge. Wheat was cultivated in richer plains, such as Thessaly or Messenia, but remained more expensive. Legumes, lentils, beans, chickpeas, served as vital sources of protein and nitrogen fixation for soil health. The olive tree, which required many years to mature, represented long-term investment and inheritance. Olive oil had a multitude of uses, as food, fuel, cosmetic, and religious offering. Its trade connected even modest landowners to wider Mediterranean markets. Vineyards, though labor-intensive, produced wine that was consumed daily, diluted with water, and exported in amphorae throughout the Aegean. Small plots of vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees complemented these staples, while beekeeping supplied honey, the primary sweetener of the ancient diet. Farming followed an annual cycle deeply integrated with the seasons and religious festivals. Autumn rains marked the time for ploughing and sowing, using simple wooden or iron-tipped ploughs drawn by oxen. Weeding and hoeing occupied the winter months, while spring brought the harvest of pulses and the tending of vines. By early summer, the grain harvest began. Reaping was performed with sickles, the grain bound in sheaves, threshed on open floors by oxen and winnowed in the wind. Storage in sealed jars or pits protected grain from moisture and pests. Although Greek political ideology praised the self-sufficient farmer, few households could function without supplementary labor. Families relied on a combination of kinship, hired hands, and enslaved workers. Enslaved men and women performed a wide range of rural tasks, ploughing, harvesting, and tending livestock. But free peasants and sharecroppers formed the backbone of production. Sharecropping arrangements, known as hectamarrage, are well attested in Attica before Solon's reforms in the early 6th century BCE. Tenants cultivated the land of wealthier citizens and paid a sixth of their produce as rent. Solon's legislation abolished the worst abuses of debt bondage, but tenancy remained common throughout Greek history. Agricultural manuals from later antiquity, such as those of Xenophon, suggest that farms were typically small, perhaps 5 to 10 hectares, and required continuous manual labor from all members of the household. In regions like Laconia and Messenia, the Spartan economy relied upon a distinct system of servitude. The Helots, an unfree population bound to the land, provided agricultural labor for the Spartan warrior class. Unlike chattel slaves, helots were communal property of the state rather than individuals, yet their subjugation was harsh and perpetual. This system freed male citizens for military training and demonstrates how agriculture underpinned even the most militarized societies of Greece. Greek agriculture was primarily subsistence-based, but local and regional trade supplemented deficiencies. Farmers brought surplus oil, wine or pottery to market towns, exchanging them for iron tools, salt, or imported grain. Coinage, introduced in the 6th century BCE, facilitated these exchanges and integrated rural economies into the broader circuits of the polis. Yet monetary transactions remained limited. Barter and credit were frequent. Transport was slow and expensive. Roads were rudimentary, and ox carts moved at little more than walking pace. Consequently, most trade occurred by sea. Coastal communities shipped olive oil, wine, and pottery in bulk amphorae, returning with grain and luxury goods. This maritime dependence shaped both the economic and strategic policies of major city-states. Athens, whose population exceeded 200,000 at its height, could not sustain itself without imported grain from the Black Sea and Egypt. Naval power, therefore, was as much an agricultural necessity as a military one. Agriculture and religion were inseparable in the Greek world. Fertility, rainfall, and harvest were perceived as gifts of the gods, requiring continual ritual observance. Demeter, goddess of the grain, and her daughter Persephone were central to rural piety. The annual Thesmophoria, celebrated by women, honored Demeter's sorrow and renewal, symbolizing the fertility of both earth and household. The Eleusinian mysteries, initiated near Athens, dramatized the same mythic cycle of death and rebirth. Offerings of first fruits, known as aparchai, were made at temples following the harvest. Sacrifices to Zeus for rain and to Dionysus for the grape vintage punctuated the year. These rites reaffirmed the dependence of human labor on divine favor. They also reinforced social cohesion. Festivals provided occasions for collective feasting, redistribution of meat, and reaffirmation of civic identity. In this sense, religion functioned as an agrarian calendar that ordered both work and worship. The life of the Greek farmer was precarious. A single failed harvest could lead to debt or famine. Literary sources, including Hesiod's works and days, underscore the constant struggle against weather, pests, and scarcity. Archaeological evidence from settlement patterns suggests frequent abandonment of marginal lands after poor years. In times of prolonged crisis, migration and colonization offered an escape. The wave of Greek colonization between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, spreading from Asia Minor to Sicily and southern Italy, was driven in part by population pressure and the search for arable land. Disease and famine frequently accompanied war. During the Peloponnesian War, the Attic countryside was repeatedly ravaged by Spartan invasions, forcing rural populations behind Athens's long walls. The resulting overcrowding contributed to the outbreak of the plague in 430 BCE, which decimated both urban and rural populations. Such episodes illustrate how fragile the balance between city and countryside could be in a pre-industrial society. Greek writers idealized the independent farmer as the moral foundation of the polis. Philosophers such as Aristotle and Xenophon praised agricultural labor for producing moderation and virtue, contrasting it with the perceived corruption of commerce. In practice, however, many citizens derived income from rents, trade, or state payments for jury service and military campaigns. The smallholder remained the ethical symbol of citizenship long after economic reality had diversified. The countryside also served as a setting for philosophical reflection. The pastoral simplicity celebrated in later Greek literature and art drew upon the enduring association between rural labor and moral integrity. Even so, most farmers lived with insecurity, limited literacy, and heavy taxation. Their quiet labor sustained the political experiments, art, and intellectual life for which Greece became renowned. The economic and social foundation of ancient Greek life was the oikos, the household. While the polis defined citizenship, justice, and collective identity, the oikos produced the material stability that made civic life possible. It was both an economic enterprise and a moral institution, a place where labor, hierarchy, and lineage intersected. Within its walls, the Greek conception of gender, family, and servitude took form. Every oikos was centered around a kyrios, the male head of household who exercised authority over its members and property. This authority was both legal and moral. Under Athenian law, the kyrios acted as the legal guardian of his wife, children, and enslaved dependents. He managed the family's estates, arranged marriages, negotiated dowries, and represented the household in all civic and religious affairs. Property ownership and citizenship were intertwined. Without property, a man could not fulfill his civic obligations or maintain his household standing. The typical urban home was modest by later standards, a small courtyard house built of mud brick or stone, usually 1 or 2 stories high. Rooms were arranged around the central courtyard, which provided light and ventilation. The andron, a formal dining room, served as a male space for symposia and guests. The gynaikonitis, the women's quarters, was located deeper within the house or on an upper floor, ensuring privacy and separation. This architectural division symbolized broader gender boundaries in Greek society. In wealthier households, additional structures stored agricultural produce, weaving equipment, and amphorae of oil and wine. Domestic altars honored Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and other household deities. The daily maintenance of these shrines reinforced the connection between religion and domestic order. Greek society was patriarchal in both ideology and law. Women's legal identity was mediated entirely through their male guardian, first their father, then their husband. Marriage was a contract between households rather than individuals, designed to ensure legitimate heirs and preserve property. In Athens, girls typically married in their mid-teens to men a decade or more older. The dowry, a sum of money or property transferred from the bride's family to her husband, was intended to secure her welfare, but also to tie the two families in economic alliance. Women's lives revolved around domestic management. Their duties included weaving, spinning, preparing food, overseeing enslaved workers, and caring for children. Weaving, in particular, held deep symbolic and economic significance. Textiles produced at home supplied clothing and trade goods. The loom stood as both a practical tool and a moral emblem of feminine virtue. Literary and artistic depictions, from Homeric epics to Attic vase paintings, consistently portray women at the loom, embodying industriousness, modesty, and silence. Despite their exclusion from politics, women participated actively in religion. Female priesthoods, festivals, and domestic rituals provided the most visible forms of public female agency. Festivals such as the Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter, were organized and led by women, emphasizing fertility, household continuity, and communal cohesion. In this religious sphere, women's roles were indispensable, though always framed within the ideology of domesticity and fertility. The functioning of the oikos depended heavily on enslaved labor. Enslaved persons performed the most arduous domestic and productive tasks, grinding grain, fetching water, tending fires, and caring for children. In rural households, they also labored in olive groves and vineyards, while urban households employed them as servants, cooks, or workshop assistants. The number of enslaved individuals per household varied widely, from 1 or 2 in modest homes to dozens in wealthy estates. Slavery in Greece was not based on race, but on conquest, birth, and trade. Enslaved people were acquired through warfare, piracy, or purchase from foreign markets, including Thrace, Scythia, and Asia Minor. Some were born into servitude, others were victims of debt or displacement. In legal terms, slaves were property, lacking citizenship and the right to marry or own land. They could be bought, sold, or freed at their owner's discretion. Despite their lack of rights, the conditions of enslaved persons differed by occupation. Domestic slaves in smaller households often lived closely with their masters, while those in workshops, mines, or agricultural estates endured far harsher conditions. The silver mines at Laurion in Attica, worked by enslaved laborers under brutal circumstances, generated much of Athens' wealth during the 5th century BCE. Ancient sources, including Xenophon and Demosthenes, describe the exploitation of hundreds of enslaved miners, leased from private owners to the state. Mortality rates were high, and the labor was relentless. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was possible but relatively rare. Freed persons often remained bound to their former masters as clients or resident foreigners, metics. Their status improved, but full citizenship remained unattainable. The reliance on slavery thus remained embedded in every layer of Greek society. Children were integral to the oikos, as heirs, laborers, and symbols of continuity. Infancy was precarious. High mortality rates meant that many children did not survive beyond early childhood. Archaeological evidence from burial sites confirms the frequency of infant and child death. Surviving children entered roles defined by gender and class. Boys received basic education in literacy, music, and athletics, preparing them for citizenship and warfare. From age 7, they attended small schools or tutors, learning Homeric poetry, arithmetic, and physical discipline. At 18, Athenian youths undertook ephebic training, a 2-year military and civic program that marked the transition to adulthood. Girls remained at home, learning domestic skills and religious rites from their mothers and older women. Exposure, the practice of abandoning unwanted infants, was a grim but acknowledged aspect of family life. Infants deemed weak, deformed, or economically burdensome could be left to die or occasionally rescued and raised as slaves. The practice reflected both economic necessity and patriarchal control over reproduction. Economically, the oikos functioned as both a unit of production and consumption. Households produced much of what they needed: food, clothing, and small trade goods. Women's textile production, for example, contributed to household income and, in some cases, local markets. Wealthier households diversified their investments, leasing land, lending money, or engaging in trade through intermediaries. Yet even in prosperous homes, domestic self-sufficiency was considered virtuous. Dependence on external markets was viewed with suspicion, associated with moral weakness and luxury. The household was also a site of credit and patronage. Wealthy citizens extended loans or employed clients and dependents, reinforcing social hierarchies through economic exchange. This informal network of obligations underpinned the broader civic economy. When viewed collectively, thousands of interconnected households formed the economic backbone of the polis, producing not only goods, but also the citizens upon whom democracy, law, and warfare depended. Household religion served both spiritual and social purposes. The hearth, dedicated to Hestia, symbolized unity and protection. Offerings of wine, grain, or incense were made daily to household gods and ancestors. Life events, birth, marriage, death, were marked by ritual acts performed within the home. Upon marriage, a bride's procession to her husband's house symbolized her integration into his lineage and his gods. Upon death, family members tended graves and offered libations, maintaining the connection between living and dead. These domestic rituals reinforced hierarchy, continuity, and belonging. The household thus mirrored the polis in miniature, governed by hierarchy, sustained by labor, and bound by shared belief. In both, freedom for some depended on subordination for others. Urban life in ancient Greece reflected a striking tension between simplicity and sophistication. Greek cities were not vast metropolises by modern standards. Athens, the largest, may have had a population of 200,000 to 250,000 people at its height in the 5th century BCE, including women, children, metics, and enslaved persons. Yet within their compact boundaries, these cities concentrated extraordinary energy in trade, craftsmanship, intellectual activity, and civic ritual. The Greek polis was both a physical place and an idea, a community built upon the interaction of diverse economic classes and social roles. A typical polis was arranged around several key spaces: the Acropolis, the Agora, and surrounding residential districts. The Acropolis served as the religious and symbolic center, elevated and fortified. The Agora lay below, functioning as both marketplace and civic hub. Temples, stoas, covered colonnades, law courts, and administrative offices framed the Agora, while streets radiated outward toward neighborhoods of homes and workshops. Urban planning varied across regions. In many older cities such as Athens, streets developed irregularly, following natural contours. In contrast, colonies and newer cities like Miletus or Olynthus adopted orthogonal grid plans, influenced by early rationalist architects such as Hippodamus of Miletus in the 5th century BCE. The Hippodamian plan organized the city into zones, residential, commercial, and sacred. Anticipating later urban design principles, public buildings expressed civic identity rather than private wealth. Temples, theaters, gymnasia, and stoas were constructed with communal funds or through liturgies, civic obligations requiring wealthy citizens to sponsor public works or festivals. Lavish private residences were rare. Even prominent citizens like Pericles or Demosthenes lived in homes of modest size and decoration, compared with the monumental architecture of public spaces. The polis demanded that wealth serve the community's visibility rather than personal luxury. The agora was the beating heart of Greek urban economy. Each morning, merchants and farmers arrived to sell grain, fish, olives, oil, pottery, textiles, and metal goods. Stalls were arranged by trade, and transactions were overseen by market officials known as agoranomoi, who regulated weights, measures, and prices. Despite later romantic notions of barter, coinage was standard in most city-states by the 5th century BCE. Athens's silver drachma became one of the most stable currencies of the ancient Mediterranean, its reliability grounded in the Laurian mines of southern Attica. Trade extended beyond local markets to interregional and overseas commerce. Athens imported grain from the Black Sea, timber from Macedonia, and metals from Cyprus. It exported olive oil, fine pottery, and luxury goods. Corinth specialized in ceramics and shipbuilding, while Rhodes became known for maritime trade and harbor facilities. City-states along the Aegean and Ionian coasts thrived on seaborne exchange, and harbors like the Piraeus became economic lifelines. Merchant activity was largely managed by metics, resident foreigners without full citizenship. They handled shipping, banking, and wholesale trade, roles that Athenian citizens often viewed as necessary but socially inferior. Although profitable, commerce was ideologically suspect among elites. Greek moral thought valorized the self-sufficient landowner and regarded profit-seeking as potentially corrupting. Nonetheless, the city's prosperity depended on merchants and craftsmen who sustained its daily life. Artisans formed a significant portion of the urban population. Workshops clustered near the agora or along major roads. Occupations ranged from potters, sculptors, and bronze workers to tanners, cobblers, and carpenters. Many artisans were free but not citizens. Others were enslaved workers managed by masters or foremen. Athenian pottery achieved an international reputation for both quality and artistry. The red and black figure vases of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE depict mythological scenes, daily activities, and athletic contests. These vessels were not luxury goods, but widely distributed items used for storage, transport, and ritual offerings. Bronze work and sculpture, too, flourished, supported by public commissions for temples and sanctuaries. Craftsmanship often operated within the family. Sons inherited their father's trades, while apprenticeships trained outsiders. Wages for skilled workers could be respectable. A master craftsman might earn enough to own a modest home and enslaved assistants. However, manual labor remained socially stigmatized in elite discourse. Philosophers like Aristotle distinguished between productive labor, which generated goods, and contemplative life, which pursued virtue. This hierarchy relegated artisans to the lower rungs of the moral order, even as their work sustained the visible culture of the polis. By the classical period, Greek cities had developed complex financial systems. Money changers and bankers, called trapezitai, operated small tables, trapeza, in the agora, exchanging currencies and offering loans. Maritime loans financed voyages secured by cargo and ship. Interest rates were high, reflecting the risks of trade. Some exceeded 20% per voyage. Public funds were also managed through treasuries, such as the Delian League's Athenian treasury, which financed civic building projects, including the Parthenon. Private banking remained small-scale but vital. Freedmen and metics dominated the sector, as citizens often regarded banking as unseemly. Wealthy landowners instead invested in liturgies or religious dedications to enhance social prestige. Nonetheless, the circulation of money and credit underpinned both domestic and international trade networks, linking local markets to the broader Mediterranean economy. Greek society was rigidly hierarchical, even within the city. Citizens occupied the top tier, defined by free birth, property, and political participation. Below them stood metics, who paid special taxes and served in the military, but lacked voting rights. Enslaved persons formed the lowest class, their labor present in every street, workshop, and household. Within the citizen body, distinctions of wealth and occupation created further gradations. In Athens, Solon's reforms, early 6th century BCE, classified citizens into 4 property classes: pentakosiomedimnoi, highest; hippies, horsemen; zeugitai, yoked men or small landholders; and thetes, laborers, Political eligibility and military duty corresponded to these classes. The wealthiest served as cavalry, the middling as hoplites, and the poorest as rowers in the fleet. Though all could vote in the assembly, the distribution of power favored those with resources. Economic inequality was visible, but managed through civic expectations of generosity. Wealthy citizens financed religious festivals, dramatic competitions, and trireme crews through liturgies, earning honor and status. The choregia, sponsorship of dramatic performances, offered one of the few socially approved ways to display wealth. Failure to perform liturgical duties invited public shame and litigation. Thus, conspicuous generosity replaced conspicuous consumption as the hallmark of elite prestige. Urban housing reflected modest means. Most homes were built of sun-dried brick and wood, plastered and whitewashed, with tiled or thatched roofs. Streets were narrow and unpaved, sanitation primitive. Water came from public fountains. Waste was removed by hand or thrown into alleys. Public baths and fountains offered relief but were often crowded. Despite these limitations, Greek cities maintained remarkable civic amenities for their time: theatres, gymnasia, and sanctuaries accessible to all citizens. Lighting was provided by oil lamps, heating by charcoal braziers. Domestic interiors were sparsely furnished, featuring wooden stools, small tables, and storage chests. Wealthier homes possessed painted pottery, fine textiles, and decorative mosaics, though ostentation remained limited by cultural norms. Public cleanliness, ritual purity, and civic order were valued more highly than private luxury. Urban life was noisy, crowded, and vital. Streets teemed with vendors calling prices, children running errands, and citizens arguing politics. Festivals and processions punctuated the year, transforming the city into a stage of collective identity. The Panathenaic festival in Athens, for instance, gathered citizens, metics, and foreigners in a grand procession to the Acropolis, reaffirming civic unity through spectacle. Intellectual and cultural life also thrived in urban settings. Philosophers lectured in gymnasia, playwrights staged tragedies and comedies in open-air theatres, and orators debated in public assemblies. The city was both a school and a theatre of citizenship, where speech and performance intertwined. Yet beneath this civic energy lay fragility. Urban populations depended on imported grain, vulnerable to blockade or drought. Epidemics, such as the Athenian plague of 430 BCE, could devastate the dense quarters of the city. Political upheaval and class conflict occasionally erupted, as in the oligarchic coups of 401 and 404 BCE. Still, the polis remained the defining institution of Greek civilization, a self-governing community that fused economy, culture, and identity into a single human landscape. Religion permeated every aspect of ancient Greek life. It was not a separate sphere of belief, as in later Western traditions, but a constant presence that organized time, place, and social identity. The Greeks did not conceive of religion as a matter of private faith or doctrine. Rather, it was a public practice, a system of rituals, sacrifices, and festivals that bound communities to their gods and to one another. The moral world of the Greeks was inseparable from this religious framework. Every polis honored its own pantheon and cultivated civic rituals that reflected its political and economic structure. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and countless smaller cities all maintained unique calendars of sacrifice and celebration. In these festivals, religion, politics, and economy converged. The gods received honor, citizens displayed loyalty, and the community renewed its sense of order. Greek religion was polytheistic, anthropomorphic, and local. The Olympian gods were imagined as human in form and emotion, but immortal and vastly powerful. Zeus governed the sky and law. Hera presided over marriage, Athena embodied wisdom and warcraft, Apollo oversaw prophecy and the arts, Demeter and Dionysus governed fertility and renewal. Beneath them existed countless local deities, heroes, nymphs, and spirits. There was no sacred scripture, no centralized priesthood, and no universal creed. Instead, knowledge of the divine was transmitted through custom, poetry, and civic tradition. Homer and Hesiod provided a common mythological vocabulary, but interpretation varied by city and generation. The authority of religion lay not in dogma, but in performance, in doing what one's ancestors had done. To worship correctly was to maintain harmony between mortals and gods, a balance called eusebeia, piety. Temples served as dwellings for the gods, not congregational spaces. Ordinary worship took place outside, at altars where sacrifices were made. The smell of burning thigh bones and fat rising from the altar was the essence of communication between human and divine. Festivals, processions, music, and athletic contests complemented these offerings, reinforcing collective memory. Ritual sacrifice stood at the core of Greek religion. Animals, most often sheep, goats, or oxen, were offered at public and private ceremonies. The sacrificial act combined reverence and reciprocity. Mortals gave part of their livelihood to the gods, who in return granted fertility, protection, or victory. After the ritual, the meat was distributed among participants, turning sacrifice into a communal feast. This pattern linked religion directly to the economy of daily life. Every harvest, voyage, or civic decision required propitiation. City magistrates consulted oracles, householders made libations before journeys, and farmers dedicated first fruits at temples. The religious calendar of each polis mirrored the agricultural cycle, ensuring that divine favor accompanied the rhythm of sowing and harvest. Women played key roles in ritual life. As priestesses, they presided over sanctuaries, maintained purity, and led processions. Female-only festivals such as the Thesmophoria, honoring Demeter and Persephone, celebrated fertility through symbolic acts of death and renewal. Married women withdrew from their households for 3 days to perform secret rites, ensuring the fecundity of the land and the stability of families. These ceremonies reveal how gender and religion intertwined. Women's exclusion from politics found partial compensation in their indispensable role in religious continuity. Civic religion was the visible expression of the polis unity. Each city had a patron deity whose favor defined its identity. Athens revered Athena Parthenos, whose colossal chryselephantine statue by Phidias dominated the Parthenon. Sparta honored Artemis Orthia and Apollo Amyclaeus. Corinth looked to Poseidon, Delos to Apollo, Ephesus to Artemis. Festivals served as both worship and public theatre. The Panathenaea, held every 4 years in Athens, combined athletic contests, music competitions, and a grand procession to the Acropolis. A new robe, peplos, woven by selected maidens, was presented to Athena's statue, symbolizing the renewal of civic order. The Dionysia, dedicated to Dionysus, featured dramatic performances that gave birth to tragedy and comedy. Through theatre, moral and political issues were explored under divine sanction, a striking example of how religion nurtured intellectual and artistic life. Religious offices were civic appointments. Priests and priestesses were often chosen from prominent families, and public funds maintained sanctuaries and sacrifices. Temples were not only religious spaces, but also treasuries and archives. The Parthenon, for instance, stored the financial reserves of the Delian League. Thus, religion was inseparable from governance and finance. Alongside civic worship existed mystery religions, which offered initiates personal experiences of divine truth and hope for the afterlife. The most famous were the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, celebrated annually near Athens. Initiates, mystai, underwent secret rites symbolizing death and rebirth, promising blessings in the next world. Although details remain obscure, these ceremonies influenced later concepts of salvation and immortality. Other cults of Dionysus, Orpheus, and Isis emphasized ecstasy, purification, and the transcendence of ordinary boundaries. Unlike the public festivals of the polis, mystery cults appealed to individual emotion, yet even they operated within civic frameworks. Cities regulated and sponsored their rituals. Greek religion thus balanced collective obligation and private yearning, maintaining cohesion without suppressing personal devotion. Greek morality did not derive from divine commandments, but from notions of honor, time, and measure, sophrosyne. The gods enforced cosmic order, but did not dictate specific laws. Virtue consisted in moderation and respect for limits. The greatest moral danger was hubris, arrogant overreach that offended divine order and invited nemesis, retribution. Tragedy dramatized this moral vision. Figures like Oedipus, Agamemnon, and Creon fell not because of malice, but because of blindness and excess. The relationship between mortals and gods was reciprocal yet uncertain. The gods were just but also capricious, capable of jealousy or deception. Humans sought to interpret divine will through oracles, the most famous being the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi. There, priestesses known as Pythiae delivered cryptic prophecies under divine inspiration. City-states consulted Delphi before wars or colonization, intertwining religion with diplomacy and expansion. Religion unified Greek society across class and gender. Civic festivals brought together citizens, metics, and sometimes enslaved persons. Sacrifices redistributed resources, while processions and games reinforced shared identity. Religious obligations also disciplined the wealthy. Sponsoring sacrifices and festivals served as both piety and public duty. At the same time, religious exclusion mirrored social hierarchy. Only citizens could participate fully in certain rites, and enslaved persons lacked legal standing in civic religion. Yet they too absorbed the rhythms of sacred time, resting on festival days, sharing in feasts, and appealing to household gods. Religion thus transcended social boundaries while reinforcing them. Greek religion shaped Western concepts of the sacred and the civic. Its emphasis on ritual rather than belief, on beauty as a form of piety, and on the divine as immanent in nature, influenced later philosophical and artistic traditions. Even after the rise of Christianity, Greek religious forms, the temple, the procession, the hymn, persisted in new guises. At its heart, Greek religion expressed a worldview in which the human and divine coexisted in fragile harmony. The polis enacted that harmony through public worship. The household sustained it through daily offerings. Together, they formed a moral cosmos where duty, beauty, and reverence intertwined. In the classical Greek world, war was not an exceptional condition, but a recurrent feature of civic life. Every polis existed in a state of potential hostility with its neighbors, and military service was considered both a duty and a mark of citizenship. The Greeks viewed warfare not merely as a contest of strength, but as a test of courage, discipline, and communal order. The battlefield became the arena where civic ideals of honor and solidarity were most clearly expressed. The defining institution of Greek warfare was the hoplite phalanx. From the 7th century BCE onward, Greek armies consisted primarily of heavily armed infantrymen, citizen soldiers drawn from the agricultural classes. The hoplite's equipment was both expensive and symbolic. He carried a round, bronze-faced shield, aspis, a spear, a short sword, a bronze helmet, cuirass and greaves. These arms cost the equivalent of several months' income, restricting full participation to men of property who could afford their own armor. The hoplite fought not as an individual, but as part of a collective formation. Each man's shield overlapped with that of his neighbor, creating a moving wall of bronze. Success depended on unity and discipline rather than heroics. This tactical interdependence mirrored the cooperative ethos of the polis itself. The hoplite phalanx became a physical embodiment of civic equality. All stood in line together, each responsible for the protection of others. The connection between military service and citizenship was fundamental. Only those who fought for the polis could claim a voice in its affairs. In Athens, property classifications determined military roles. Wealthier citizens served as cavalry, hippes, middle ranks as hoplites, and the poorest as naval rowers. Despite differences of wealth, all contributed to the defense of the community. This shared risk bound the citizen body together, transforming war into a civic institution. Greek conceptions of honor, time, and excellence, arete, found their most visible expression in warfare. To fight bravely for one's polis was the highest civic virtue. Cowardice, conversely, was a form of moral failure carrying social stigma. Inscriptions and funerary monuments across Greece commemorate the fallen as models of civic devotion. The Athenian funeral oration, delivered annually after major battles, celebrated not individual glory, but collective sacrifice for freedom. The moral vocabulary of war drew heavily on the Homeric tradition. The Iliad presented combat as a field of personal valor and tragic inevitability. By the classical period, this heroic ethos had been adapted to the realities of communal warfare. Courage was no longer the privilege of aristocrats, but the duty of every citizen soldier. Philosophers such as Aristotle later redefined courage as a rational mean between rashness and cowardice, aligning it with civic virtue rather than personal fame. Nevertheless, the brutality of war remained undeniable. Battles were short but intense, lasting less than an hour. Casualties, though limited in number, carried heavy psychological and political weight. Defeat exposed cities to enslavement, devastation, or loss of autonomy. Greek religion sanctified warfare through sacrifices to Ares and Athena, yet also acknowledged its moral cost. Tragic drama often explored this tension between honor and destruction, as in Aeschylus's Persians, which portrayed the grief of enemies with profound sympathy. The rise of naval power in the 5th century BCE, particularly in Athens, transformed both warfare and social structure. The Athenian fleet of triremes, sleek warships propelled by 170 rowers, dominated the Aegean during the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Rowers were drawn largely from the lowest citizen class, the Thetes, who lacked the property to serve as hoplites. Their labor at the oar granted them new political leverage, reinforcing Athens's radical democracy. Naval service demanded coordination and discipline on an unprecedented scale. Victory depended on speed, timing, and collective rhythm rather than individual prowess. The oarsmen's chant synchronized motion and morale, while the captain, triarch, managed both strategy and logistics. Naval warfare thus democratized the military ideal. Courage became a matter of endurance and cooperation rather than wealth or lineage. Sea power also reshaped the economy. Athens' empire, the Delian League, relied on maritime tribute, shipping and trade. Shipbuilding created jobs for carpenters, rope makers, and metallurgists. The navy provided steady pay, attracting both citizens and metics. War and commerce intertwined, making Athens both a military and economic superpower. Military training began early. Boys learned physical fitness through running, wrestling, and javelin throwing. At 18, Athenian youths entered the Ephebeia, a 2-year program combining military instruction with civic education. Ephebes patrolled borders, learned drill formations, and performed religious ceremonies linking military service to the gods. Sparta institutionalized this process to its extreme. From age 7, Spartan boys entered the agoge, a rigorous state-run system emphasizing endurance, obedience, and communal loyalty. The entire social order of Sparta was organized around perpetual readiness for war. Its citizens, known as homoioi, equals, lived in barracks and devoted their lives to military training, supported by the labor of the subjugated Helot population. Spartan women expected to bear strong sons, trained physically as well, making Sparta unique in its inclusion of female athleticism. Discipline defined Greek warfare as much as courage. Success required cohesion in battle and restraint in victory. The rules of engagement, timed truces for the dead, seasonal campaigning, and respect for temples reflected a moral framework that limited destruction among Greek cities. Though violated in practice, these conventions distinguished Greek warfare from purely predatory raiding and reinforced the notion of war as an extension of civic order. The constant recurrence of war shaped the political and economic life of every polis. Campaigning disrupted agriculture, depopulated villages, and redirected resources toward fortifications and fleets. Yet war also stimulated technological and economic innovation. Metallurgy, ship design, and road construction all advanced through military necessity. Politically, success in war conferred legitimacy. Victorious generals, or strategoi, gained immense prestige. In democratic Athens, military command remained subject to public scrutiny. Generals could be tried and exiled if accused of incompetence or corruption. In oligarchic states, military leadership reinforced aristocratic dominance. The balance between civic control and military authority became a recurring challenge in Greek history. The Persian Wars, 490–479 BCE, forged a collective Hellenic identity. The victories at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea demonstrated the effectiveness of citizen militias and fleets against imperial armies. Commemoration of these triumphs strengthened the ideal of freedom, eleutheria, as a defining Greek value. The subsequent Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BCE, between Athens and Sparta, revealed the darker side of this ideal: prolonged conflict, civil strife, and moral exhaustion. Thucydides' history portrayed war as both a political necessity and a test of human nature, exposing the fragility of justice and reason under stress. Greek culture preserved the memory of war through art, literature, and ritual. Epic poetry celebrated heroism. Tragedy confronted its costs. Sculptures on temple friezes depicted battles between Greeks and barbarians as moral allegories of order versus chaos. Public monuments such as the Athenian cenotaph honored the collective dead, transforming private grief into civic virtue. Philosophers debated the moral dimensions of war. Plato regarded it as an inevitable consequence of human desire and competition, but sought to subordinate it to rational governance. Aristotle, while recognizing its necessity, defined the highest purpose of war as peace, the condition enabling the pursuit of virtue. This tension between necessity and morality remained unresolved, yet it framed Western reflections on war for centuries. For the Greeks, military service was the crucible of citizenship. To stand in the phalanx or row in the trireme was to enact belonging. Courage, endurance, and discipline were civic as well as personal virtues. The battlefield mirrored the assembly. Both demanded collective decision and mutual trust. Through warfare, the abstract ideals of equality and freedom were translated into action. Yet the inclusiveness of this ideal was limited. Women, metics, and enslaved persons, though essential to the functioning of the polis, were excluded from military and political participation. the same system that valorized shared sacrifice rested upon exclusion and dependency. In this paradox lay the enduring complexity of Greek civilization, a society that equated virtue with freedom, but defined freedom narrowly. The intellectual vitality of ancient Greece ranks among its most enduring legacies. Within the framework of the polis, Greek thinkers cultivated a sustained inquiry into nature, ethics, and politics that shaped the foundations of Western thought. Philosophy, education, and public discourse together formed a culture that prized reason, logos, as the highest expression of human capacity. Yet this rational curiosity coexisted with myth, tradition, and religion, reflecting a civilization that sought balance between order and mystery rather than their opposition. Greek philosophy originated in the Eastern Aegean, particularly in the Ionian cities of Asia Minor during the 6th century BCE. The earliest thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes of Miletus, shifted attention from mythic explanation to natural causes. They asked not how the gods governed the world, but what fundamental substance, arche, underlay it. Thales proposed water as the primary element, Anaximenes air, Anaximander, a boundless and indeterminate principle he called the apeiron. These inquiries inaugurated a tradition of rational investigation that later generations called philosophy, the love of wisdom. The Pythagoreans of southern Italy linked mathematics to cosmic harmony, discovering that numerical ratios governed musical intervals and celestial movements. Heraclitus of Ephesus described the universe as a dynamic flux governed by a rational principle, the logos. Parmenides of Elea, by contrast, argued that change was illusory and that true reality was unchanging being. These early debates introduced concepts, being, unity, change, and reason, that remained central to philosophy ever after. Greek intellectual culture developed not in isolation, but through dialogue, performance, and competition. Philosophers taught in public spaces, poets recited at festivals, and sophists offered rhetorical instruction for pay. The city, with its assemblies and law courts, demanded skill in argument and persuasion. As a result, philosophy evolved alongside rhetoric and politics, producing a tradition that saw reasoning itself as a civic art. Education, paideia in the Greek world, aimed at forming the character of free citizens. Its goal was not merely technical skill, but moral and intellectual excellence, arete. Boys began schooling around age 7. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and music from private tutors or small local schools. Music, central to Greek education, cultivated rhythm, discipline, and appreciation of harmony, which were believed to mirror ethical order. Physical education was equally important. The gymnasium trained boys in running, wrestling, and javelin throwing, preparing them for both warfare and public life. Athletic competition reflected ideals of balance between body and mind. Victors in local and pan-Hellenic games, such as the Olympics, brought honor to their city and demonstrated civic virtue. By adolescence, wealthier youths might study under philosophers or rhetoricians. Instruction in rhetoric prepared them for participation in courts and assemblies, while philosophy offered training in logic, ethics, and metaphysics. The most ambitious traveled to intellectual centers such as Athens or Alexandria in later periods. Education thus served both as a means of social distinction and as a mechanism for transmitting civic values. Women's education was limited and domestic. In most polis, girls learned household management, weaving, and religious observances from their mothers. Only in rare cases, such as among Spartan women or the hetairai, educated courtesans of Athens, did women receive formal instruction. Nevertheless, through religious and ritual participation, women contributed significantly to the transmission of moral and cultural traditions. In the 5th century BCE, a new class of intellectuals known as the sophists emerged. Traveling teachers such as Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias taught rhetoric, grammar, and philosophy for a fee. They emphasized the art of persuasion and the relativity of truth, arguing that human opinion and convention determined morality and law. Protagoras' declaration that man is the measure of all things captured the intellectual mood of democratic Athens, where success in the assembly and law courts depended on eloquence. The sophists democratized knowledge, but also provoked controversy. Critics accused them of undermining traditional values by substituting argument for truth. Their focus on persuasive technique over moral conviction raised fears that language could manipulate rather than illuminate. Yet their influence was profound. They transformed education into a civic enterprise and made reasoned debate a hallmark of Athenian public life. The philosopher Socrates, 469–399 BCE, responded to the sophists by redirecting inquiry from nature and rhetoric to ethics and the examined life. Unlike the sophists, he refused payment and claimed ignorance as his method's foundation. Through dialogue, Elenchus, he questioned assumptions about justice, courage, and virtue, seeking definitions grounded in reason rather than tradition. Socrates' insistence that virtue was knowledge challenged conventional morality and the authority of the polis. His trial and execution in 399 BCE on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth dramatized the tension between individual conscience and civic authority. His death made him a martyr for philosophy and inspired his students, notably Plato and Xenophon, to preserve his teachings. Plato, 427–347 BCE, transformed Socratic ethics into a comprehensive philosophical system. In his dialogues, he proposed that reality consists of two levels, the changing world of appearances and the eternal world of forms, perfect, unchanging ideas that embody truth and beauty. Knowledge, he argued, is recollection of these forms through dialectical reasoning. In the Republic, Plato envisioned an ideal state governed by philosopher kings who combined wisdom with virtue. Education in mathematics, music, and dialectic would lead selected individuals from ignorance to enlightenment, culminating in contemplation of the good, the highest principle. Plato's Academy, founded around 387 BCE, became the first institutional school of philosophy in the Western world, influencing thought for centuries. Aristotle, 384–322 BCE, Plato's student, broke from his teacher's metaphysical idealism to emphasize empirical observation. For Aristotle, knowledge began with sense experience and progressed through systematic classification and analysis. He studied biology, physics, politics, ethics, and logic, seeking universal principles through inductive reasoning. In politics, he defined humans as political animals, whose fulfillment lies in participation within the polis. Virtue, for Aristotle, was a habit cultivated through moderation and rational choice, the golden mean. His Lyceum, founded in Athens, functioned as both research center and educational institution, combining theoretical inquiry with practical study. Aristotle's works established the intellectual vocabulary of Western science and ethics. Philosophy in Greece was not confined to schools. It permeated public discourse, influencing law, art, and daily conversation. The open spaces of the city, the agora, gymnasium, and symposium, served as venues for debate. The philosopher's role was both teacher and critic, questioning assumptions that underpinned civic life. Education and intellectual culture reinforced the Greek conviction that reason could discern order in both nature and society. Mathematics revealed harmony and proportion. Medicine, pioneered by Hippocrates, sought natural explanations for disease. History, as written by Herodotus and Thucydides, treated human events as subject to cause and analysis rather than divine whim. The habit of rational inquiry, once confined to speculative cosmology, became a defining trait of Hellenic civilization. The intellectual life of the polis remained an elite pursuit. Most citizens, and nearly all women and enslaved persons, were excluded from formal education. Yet, the ethos of rational discussion permeated civic institutions. Jury trials, assemblies, and councils all relied on argument and persuasion rather than hereditary authority. The same spirit that animated the philosophers' dialogue shaped the citizens' debate. By the 4th century BCE, Greek intellectual life extended beyond the polis. Macedonian expansion under Philip II and Alexander the Great spread Greek language and education throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. In the ensuing Hellenistic age, philosophy diversified into schools, Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, that addressed the individual's search for peace in an increasingly cosmopolitan world. The legacy of classical Greek philosophy lies not only in its ideas, but in its method, the conviction that human reason, applied through dialogue and observation, can reveal truth and guide moral life. Within the polis, thought itself became a civic virtue. To question, argue, and seek understanding was to participate in the highest form of citizenship. The art and architecture of ancient Greece expressed more than decoration or display. They embodied the civilization's deepest convictions about order, proportion, and moral balance. In sculpture, temple design, and even everyday pottery, the Greeks sought to translate abstract principles, measure, metron, harmony, harmonia, and beauty, kalos, into visible form. Artistic achievement was thus inseparable from the intellectual and civic ideals of the polis. Greek art evolved from the geometric rigidity of the early Iron Age to the naturalism of the classical period. The earliest vase paintings, produced between the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, used linear patterns, meanders, triangles, and concentric circles to impose order on simple shapes. By the 7th century BCE, under Eastern influence, the Orientalizing style introduced floral motifs, mythic creatures, and narrative scenes. These artistic changes reflected growing contact with the Near East through trade and colonization. The Archaic period, circa 700–480 BCE, marked the first flowering of monumental sculpture. The characteristic figures were the kouros and kor, idealized young men and women standing rigidly, 1 foot forward, arms at the sides. Carved from marble, they reflected Egyptian influence in posture but diverged sharply in spirit. The Greek sculptor sought to depict vitality and potential rather than mere form. By the late 6th century BCE, artists like Antenor and Aristion of Paros achieved increasing anatomical accuracy, foreshadowing the realism of classical art. This progression from formality to fluidity mirrored the broader intellectual movement toward observation and proportion. The concept of symmetria, balanced relationship of parts, became the guiding principle of sculpture and architecture. Greek aesthetics did not define beauty as ornament, but as the harmonious correspondence between structure and purpose. Greek architecture, above all, was public architecture. Temples, stoas, theatres, and gymnasia dominated the urban landscape, expressing communal devotion rather than individual wealth. Private houses remained simple and functional. It was the public spaces that proclaimed the city's moral and political order. The temple stood at the center of this vision. It was not a gathering hall, but a house for the deity, visible proof of divine protection and civic unity. The Greek temple evolved from simple wooden structures into complex stone monuments defined by their columnar orders, Doric, Ionic, and later Corinthian. The Doric order, the earliest and simplest, emerged in the Peloponnese in the 7th century BCE. Characterized by sturdy columns without bases and plain capitals, it conveyed strength and austerity. The Parthenon in Athens, 447 to 432 BCE, represents its perfection, massive yet balanced, disciplined yet graceful. The Ionic order, lighter and more decorative, developed in the Ionian Islands and Asia Minor. Its volute capitals and slender proportions suggested refinement and movement. The Corinthian order, appearing in the late classical period, embellished Ionic elegance with acanthus leaves, symbolizing a shift toward ornate complexity. Greek architects pursued visual harmony through subtle refinements. The Parthenon's columns, for example, swell slightly at midshaft entasis to correct optical illusion. The stylobate or base platform curves gently upward to convey equilibrium. These refinements demonstrate a mathematical precision inspired by both geometry and philosophical ideals of order. Temples functioned as the axis between human and divine. Their sculptures narrated myths of gods, heroes, and the founding of the city. The Parthenon's frieze, carved under Phidias, depicted the Panathenaic procession, uniting divine and civic spheres. The temple itself embodied the moral geometry of the polis. Its proportions reflected reason, its subject matter, shared memory, its craftsmanship, communal pride. If architecture symbolized the order of the community, sculpture represented the order of the human body. The classical style, developed in the 5th century BCE, pursued a synthesis of realism and idealism, capturing both the physical truth of anatomy and the moral ideal of restraint. The sculptor Polykleitos of Argos formulated these principles in his treatise Canon, Rule, accompanied by his statue known as the Doryphoros, spear-bearer. He demonstrated that beauty arises from mathematical proportion, the harmonious relation of each part to the whole. The Doryphoros stands in contrapposto, the poised stance, where weight shifts onto one leg, creating dynamic balance. Muscles relax and tense naturally, the body alive yet composed. Later artists expanded this vocabulary. Phidias, chief sculptor of the Parthenon, produced monumental statues of Athena and Zeus that combined divine majesty with human grace. Praxiteles, working in the 4th century BCE, softened form and introduced sensuality, as in his Aphrodite of Cnidus, the first fully nude female statue in Greek art. Lysippos, Alexander the Great's court sculptor, elongated proportions and introduced psychological intensity. These artists transformed sculpture from representation into philosophy in stone. The human body became an image of rational order, mirroring the belief that moral virtue resides in balance between excess and deficiency. To depict the body correctly was to reveal the structure of the cosmos itself. While few Greek paintings survive, vase decoration provides a continuous record of artistic development. The transition from black figure to red figure technique around 530 BCE revolutionized representation. In the red figure style, figures were left the color of the clay, while the background was painted black, allowing greater detail and fluidity. Scenes depicted myth, athletics, music, and domestic life, turning pottery into a visual encyclopedia of Greek society. Painters like Euphronios and Euthymides mastered foreshortening and motion, foreshadowing later developments in perspective. Pottery served both practical and ceremonial purposes, storage, transport, and ritual offerings. Its ubiquity made artistic imagery part of daily experience, reinforcing civic and moral ideals through ordinary objects. Wall and panel painting, now mostly lost, reached technical sophistication by the late classical period. Ancient writers praised artists such as Zeuxis and Apelles for their illusionism and expressive realism. These innovations influenced later Hellenistic and Roman art, ensuring the continuity of Greek aesthetic principles far beyond their homeland. Among all Greek arts, drama most fully integrated artistic beauty, civic identity, and moral reflection. The open-air theatre, often built into hillsides, embodied architectural mastery and acoustical precision. Performances were held at religious festivals, particularly the Dionysia, and funded through public liturgies. Tragedy and comedy alike served moral and civic purposes. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides confronted ethical dilemmas, justice, pride, and divine order through poetic structure and ritual performance. Their actors wore masks and choruses, sang in measured rhythm, transforming moral inquiry into spectacle. Comedy, represented by Aristophanes, offered satire and social critique. In both genres, art functioned as moral education for the citizen body, combining aesthetic pleasure with civic reflection. To the Greeks, beauty was not superficial. It was an attribute of truth and virtue. The term kalokagathia, combining kalos, beautiful, and agathos, good, encapsulated this unity. Physical grace and moral excellence were inseparable. A well-proportioned body signified inner harmony. An orderly building reflected civic justice. Aesthetic ideals thus carried ethical weight. Philosophers elaborated these connections. Plato, in the Symposium and Phaedrus, described beauty as the visible sign of the good, capable of elevating the soul from desire to contemplation. Aristotle grounded beauty in proportion and clarity, linking it to pleasure derived from recognition and learning. Art was imitation, mimesis, but not mere copying. It revealed universal truths through perfected form. This moralized aesthetic shaped all Greek creative expression. To sculpt, to design, or to perform was to participate in cosmic order. Disorder in art implied disorder in the soul. The civic investment in temples, theatres, and festivals reflected not luxury, but the conviction that beauty itself sustained virtue. Greek art and architecture established standards that endured throughout antiquity and beyond. Roman architects, such as Vitruvius, codified Greek principles of symmetry and proportion. Renaissance humanists revived them as models of rational design. The modern vocabulary of classical continues to denote balance, clarity, and restraint, ideals first realized in marble on the Acropolis. More fundamentally, Greek aesthetics articulated a moral vision of civilization. To create beauty was to align human work with divine order. Every column, every statue, every chorus embodied the aspiration to reconcile freedom with form, individuality with measure, and emotion with reason. The Greek achievement lay not only in what they built or carved, but in the belief that art could express truth and cultivate virtue simultaneously. Leisure in ancient Greece was not the absence of work, but a condition of human fulfillment. The Greeks distinguished between ponos, toil or labor, and schola, the time devoted to reflection, conversation, and self-cultivation. The latter word, schola, gave rise to the modern term school, capturing the Greek conviction that leisure properly used was the foundation of civilization. In this understanding, the capacity to engage in art, athletics, philosophy, and civic life depended on the freedom produced by labor, much of it performed by enslaved people and lower classes. Thus, Greek leisure was both an expression of privilege and a defining feature of the polis. Leisure carried moral and political significance. In Athens, only citizens were expected to enjoy scholae as a rightful condition of their status. Time free from manual labor enabled participation in public affairs, festivals, and philosophical discussion. The ideal citizen was not an idle aristocrat, but one who used leisure to practice virtue, cultivate the mind, and serve the community. Aristotle wrote that we work to have leisure, defining it as the ultimate purpose of human activity, an opportunity for contemplation and friendship rather than consumption. For most Greeks, however, daily life allowed little leisure. Farmers, artisans, and laborers worked long hours according to seasonal demands. Leisure for them occurred primarily during festivals, when civic or religious observances suspended normal labor. These festivals were numerous. Athens alone held more than 50 annually, ranging from major celebrations such as the Panathenaea and Dionysia to smaller local rites. Through such events, even the poor shared in the collective rhythms of rest and recreation that bound the community together. Athletic competition occupied a central role in Greek conceptions of leisure and virtue. Physical training was considered essential to the development of character. The gymnasium served not only as a training ground, but as a civic institution, a place of education, conversation, and moral instruction. Young men exercised nude, symbolizing both physical freedom and aesthetic idealism. The word gymnos, meaning naked, gave the gymnasium its name. Greek athletics were inseparable from religion. Contests honored the gods, and victory was regarded as a sign of divine favor. The four great Panhellenic games, the Olympic, Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian, drew competitors and spectators from across the Greek world. The Olympic Games, first recorded in 776 BCE, were dedicated to Zeus at Olympia and held every 4 years. Victors received no material prize, only a wreath of olive leaves and the immortal glory, kleos, of poetic celebration. Events included running, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, and the chariot race. Competitors trained rigorously under public supervision, and strict rules governed fair play. Athletic excellence embodied the Greek pursuit of balance between strength and discipline. The athlete's body was admired not merely for beauty, but for its demonstration of self-control, a physical counterpart to moral virtue. Women's participation was limited. In most cities, female athletics were restricted to religious festivals, such as the Heraia, games held in honor of Hera at Olympia, where young women competed in foot races. Spartan women, however, trained publicly in running and wrestling, reflecting Sparta's distinctive social order and emphasis on strength as a civic virtue. Festivals provided both sacred observance and social cohesion. Each polis maintained a calendar of public holidays devoted to its patron gods. Processions, sacrifices, music and dance filled the streets, transforming the city into a stage of collective identity. These events reaffirmed the reciprocal relationship between humans and gods while reinforcing civic hierarchy and unity. In Athens, the Panathenaic festival celebrated the city's patron goddess, Athena. The highlight was a grand procession from the Kerameikos cemetery to the Acropolis, culminating in the presentation of a newly woven robe, peplos, to the statue of the goddess. The festival included athletic and musical competitions, poetry recitations, and public feasting. Participation was both a duty and a privilege. It reminded citizens of their shared heritage and the gods' favor upon the city. The Dionysia, held in honor of Dionysus, blended religious ritual with theater. Tragedies and comedies performed during this festival allowed the city to reflect on moral, political, and existential questions. The theater thus became an instrument of civic education, transforming leisure into moral inquiry. Other festivals celebrated local or seasonal themes, the Thesmophoria for fertility, the Eleusinia for the mysteries of life and death, and the Anthesteria for the new wine harvest. Collectively, they structured the year into a rhythm of work and rest, duty and joy. Among the most characteristic expressions of Greek leisure was the symposium, a social gathering that combined dining, drinking, music, and conversation. The word means drinking together, but the event was as much intellectual as convivial. Symposia took place in the andron, the men's dining room, with guests reclining on couches arranged around low tables. The evening began with ritual libations to the gods, followed by courses of food and wine diluted with water in a large mixing bowl. Crater. A symposiarch or master of ceremonies regulated the ratio of wine to water, balancing pleasure with moderation. Entertainment included poetry recitations, flute girls, games, and philosophical debate. The symposium functioned as a microcosm of Greek society. It reinforced social bonds among elites, provided a venue for education and debate, and offered a controlled space for emotional release. Philosophers such as Plato used it as a literary setting for exploring the nature of love, beauty, and truth. The symposium portrays Socrates and his companions discussing the ascent from physical desire to spiritual contemplation, a dialogue that elevated leisure to the realm of philosophy. Yet the symposium also revealed the inequalities underlying Greek culture. Women, except for courtesans or entertainers, were excluded. Enslaved servants attended to guests. The pleasures of the symposium, like much of Greek leisure, rested on the labor of others. Music and dance permeated Greek leisure. Both were integral to education and festival life, linking pleasure to order. The Greeks believed that musical modes influenced moral character. The Dorian mode fostered discipline, the Phrygian passion, the Lydian gentleness. Plato and Aristotle debated the ethical effects of melody and rhythm, viewing music as a form of moral training. Lyric poetry accompanied music played on the lyre or aulos, double flute. Poets such as Sappho, Alcaeus, and Pindar celebrated love, friendship, and athletic victory, uniting personal emotion with civic ideals. Choral dance, performed during religious festivals, blended movement, poetry, and song into a single expression of communal harmony. For the Greeks, play, paideia, was serious business. It cultivated grace, discipline, and social balance. Games taught self-control and respect for rules, preparing citizens for cooperation in civic life. Even children's play, depicted on vase paintings, mirrored adult activities, mock battles, races, and ball games. Philosophers interpreted leisure and play as essential to human flourishing. Plato, in the Laws, argued that proper recreation maintained social harmony. Citizens must learn to play beautifully through music and sport, channeling emotion into order. Aristotle agreed, warning that amusement without measure degraded the soul. True leisure, they insisted, was not indulgence, but education through pleasure. Leisure spaces structured the physical life of the polis. Gymnasia and palaestrae, wrestling schools, doubled as centers of philosophy and politics. Theaters brought thousands together in shared emotional experience. Sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia functioned as pan-Hellenic meeting points where rival cities competed peacefully under divine sanction. These spaces reflected the democratic character of Greek leisure. Public enjoyment, not private luxury, defined cultural refinement. Even the poorest citizens could attend plays or festivals sponsored by wealthy patrons. In this way, leisure became both a civic right and an instrument of social cohesion. Greek leisure rested on economic and social foundations that limited its inclusivity. The ability of citizens to engage in philosophy, sport, or art depended on the labor of women, metics, and enslaved persons who maintained households and economies. This dependence was recognized, but rarely questioned. Leisure symbolized freedom, yet that freedom was restricted to a narrow class. Despite its inequities, Greek leisure forged enduring ideals, that human excellence arises from balance, that beauty and virtue are allied, and that communal celebration strengthens moral order. In its festivals, games, and symposia, the polis expressed its faith in the capacity of human beings to find joy through discipline and meaning through play. The Greek polis, which had given birth to philosophy, democracy, and the ideals of beauty and virtue, did not endure unchanged. By the 4th century BCE, the balance between independence and unity that had sustained Greek civilization began to fracture. Economic competition, class tensions, and unending wars weakened the city-states that had once defined the Greek world. Yet even in decline, the polis sowed the intellectual and institutional seeds from which later civilizations would grow. The Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BCE, between Athens and Sparta, marked a decisive turning point. What began as a contest for hegemony among equals ended in exhaustion for all. Thucydides's account of the conflict reveals not merely military struggle, but moral disintegration, plague, civil strife, stasis, and the erosion of civic virtue. The democratic energy that had once animated Athens turned inward, consumed by demagoguery and suspicion. The aftermath of the war left the Greek world fragmented. Sparta's brief dominance collapsed after its defeat by Thebes at Leuctra in 371 BCE. Thebes itself, despite the brilliance of its general Epaminondas, lacked the resources to establish lasting supremacy. The autonomy of the polis, its greatest strength and weakness, prevented durable unity. Economic inequality widened, and mercenary service replaced citizen militias. The civic ideal of shared sacrifice gave way to professional armies and oligarchic intrigue. Philosophers of the late classical period recognized the decay of the traditional polis. Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics both sought to articulate ideal constitutions capable of restoring moral order. Their diagnoses were not merely political, but ethical. The city's decline stemmed from a failure of virtue, from the substitution of desire for the common good. The philosopher's search for rational order became, in this context, an act of cultural preservation. In the northern periphery, a new power emerged. Philip II of Macedon, r. 359–336 BCE, unified his kingdom through military and administrative reform. By adopting the Greek phalanx and integrating cavalry tactics, he created a disciplined army that overwhelmed the fragmented southern states. His victory at Chaeronea in 338 BCE ended the independence of the Greek polis and inaugurated a new era of Macedonian hegemony. Philip's son, Alexander III, known to history as Alexander the Great, extended Greek power beyond anything the classical world had imagined. Between 334 and 323 BCE, he conquered the Persian Empire, marched into Egypt, and reached as far as India. In his wake, he founded new cities, most bearing his name, that became centers of Greek language and culture. Alexander's conquests dissolved the old polis order, but spread Hellenic civilization across a vast, interconnected world. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented into kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia governed territories that blended Greek and local traditions. This period, known as the Hellenistic Age, transformed Greek culture from a local civic tradition into an international phenomenon. The polis survived as a municipal unit, but lost its political independence. Cities like Alexandria, Pergamon, and Antioch eclipsed the old city-states in wealth and population. These new centers became cosmopolitan hubs of trade, science, and philosophy. Greek culture adapted to imperial structures, turning from civic virtue to personal ethics. Philosophical schools such as Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism emerged to address the anxieties of individuals in a vast empire. The Stoics, following Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue alone brings freedom and that all humanity forms a single community under divine reason, logos. The Epicureans, led by Epicurus, sought peace through moderation and friendship, rejecting fear of the gods and death. In both, the polis gave way to a universal vision of moral order. Scientific inquiry flourished in Hellenistic cities. In Alexandria, scholars at the museum and library advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Euclid codified geometry. Archimedes of Syracuse formulated principles of physics. Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted anatomical studies. Greek rationalism, now supported by royal patronage, reached new heights of precision and abstraction. Art and architecture reflected this broader world. The restrained balance of classical form gave way to dynamism and emotion. Sculptures such as the Laocoon group and the winged victory of Samothrace conveyed dramatic motion and psychological intensity. The Hellenistic style expressed the diversity and complexity of a world no longer centered on the city-state, but on human experience in all its variety. By the 2nd century BCE, the Hellenistic kingdoms faced a new imperial power, Rome. The Romans, initially provincial imitators, came to revere Greek art, philosophy, and literature. After the conquest of Greece in 146 BCE, Rome absorbed, rather than destroyed, its cultural inheritance. Roman elites studied under Greek tutors, read Homer and Plato, and decorated their villas with Greek statues. The poet Horace captured this paradox when he wrote, "Captive Greece took her rough conqueror captive." Greek language and education became the marks of refinement throughout the Roman Empire. Stoicism profoundly influenced Roman thinkers such as Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Greek artistic principles guided Roman architecture and sculpture, while Greek science informed medicine, engineering, and geography. The ideals of rational inquiry and civic virtue survived, transposed into imperial form. The influence of ancient Greece outlasted its political institutions because its deepest contributions were intellectual and moral. The polis may have fallen, but its central questions, what is justice, what is the good life, what is beauty, continued to animate human thought. Greek democracy provided the first systematic attempt to base government on reasoned deliberation rather than hereditary rule. Though limited by class and gender, its principles of citizenship and accountability re-emerged in later republican traditions. Greek philosophy established the framework of Western rationalism, from Aristotle's logic to Plato's metaphysics. Greek art defined the vocabulary of form, proportion, and representation that still shapes aesthetic judgment. Equally lasting was the Greek belief in the dignity of human reason, the conviction that the cosmos is intelligible and that humans, through inquiry, can discern its order became the foundation of science and philosophy alike. The transition from myth to rational explanation, begun by the Ionian philosophers, marked a permanent turning point in human consciousness. Greek literature preserved the emotional and moral depth of human experience. In the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, later generations found a mirror of their own conflicts between freedom and fate, pride and justice. The historians Herodotus and Thucydides taught that human affairs obey discernible causes rather than divine caprice. Poets such as Sappho and Pindar gave voice to the beauty and brevity of mortal life. Even religion, though transformed, endured in new forms. The Greek idea that the divine manifests in beauty and order shaped Christian theology and later humanism. The concept of logos, divine reason structuring the universe, passed from Stoic philosophy into the Gospel of John, bridging classical and Christian thought. The civilization that began in small city-states along the Aegean coast became the foundation of Western intellectual history. Yet the legacy of Greece is not static reverence, but continual reinterpretation. Each age has rediscovered in the Greeks something of itself, its questions, its aspirations, its contradictions. What endures is not perfection, but inquiry, the restless pursuit of understanding that refuses final answers. The Greeks believed that excellence lay in striving rather than completion. Their art, philosophy, and politics all sought harmony while acknowledging conflict as intrinsic to human nature. When the polis faded, its spirit migrated into other institutions, schools, academies, and republics, where reason and dialogue could still flourish. The forms changed, but the pursuit of wisdom endured. In this sense, Greek civilization never truly ended. Its decline was the transformation of its ideas into universal principles that continue to shape human thought. The marble ruins of temples and theatres that still stand across the Mediterranean are not mere remnants of a vanished past. They are monuments to a way of seeing the world that joined reason with beauty, freedom with order, and the divine with the human. The Greeks taught that to live well is to live thoughtfully, to make of one's life, as of one's city, a work of art shaped by justice, measure, and truth.